If you ask 10 different Avatar fans who the best written character in the entire franchise is, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some people will say Zuko because of his redemption arc. Others will say Iroh because of his wisdom. And then there are the people who'll tell you it's Azula. And honestly, they have a pretty good argument, because Azula is one of those rare villains who becomes more interesting every time you rewatch the series. When you're a kid, she's terrifying. She's the girl with blue fire who always seems 10 steps ahead of everyone else. She's manipulative, ruthless, and unbelievably talented. Every time she appears on screen, someone is about to lose. But then you grow older and something changes. You start paying less attention to what Azula does and more attention to why she does it. Why is she so obsessed with being perfect? Why does she trust fear more than love? Why is she incapable of showing weakness, even when she's completely alone? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how does someone who looked so confident, so composed, and so untouchable end up crying on the floor of the royal palace after completely losing her mind? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't one bad day, it wasn't one betrayal, and it definitely wasn't because she was simply born evil. Azula's breakdown was years in the making. It was the result of growing up in one of the most dysfunctional families in the Avatar world, where love had conditions, perfection was expected, and failure wasn't simply disappointing. It was unacceptable. By the time the events of Avatar: The Last Airbender begin, the damage has already been done. But to understand how she got there, we need to go back to the very beginning, before she became the Fire Nation's greatest princess, before she hunted the Avatar, before Ba Sing Se, before the Agni Kai that would define her life forever. We have to look at the family that raised her, because in many ways, Azula's story begins long before she was even born. The Fire Nation royal family wasn't like most families. From the outside, they represented power, prestige, and absolute authority. Every citizen looked up to them. Every soldier pledged loyalty to them. Every decision they made shaped the future of an entire nation. But behind the palace walls, things were very different. Affection wasn't something that was openly expressed. Power came before everything. Strength was admired, weakness was punished, and ambition often mattered more than family. By the time Azula was born, those values had already defined the royal family for generations. The Fire Nation had spent decades expanding its empire under Fire Lord Ozai, whose dream of sharing the Fire Nation's greatness with the rest of the world became the justification for a century-long war. His successors inherited not only the throne, but also that same belief that strength gave you the right to rule. So when Prince Ozai eventually had children, he wasn't thinking about raising a happy family. He was thinking about raising heirs worthy of the throne. Azula entered the world as the second child of Ozai and Ursa. She had an older brother, Zuko, who was only a couple of years older than her. From the very beginning, the two siblings couldn't have been more different. Zuko was emotional. He wore his heart on his sleeve. If he was angry, you knew it. If he was embarrassed, you saw it. If he was hurt, he couldn't hide it. Azula was almost the exact opposite. She was observant, patient, calculated. Even as a little girl, she had an uncanny ability to read people. She noticed their insecurities, understood what motivated them, and wasn't afraid to use that information to get what she wanted. Some fans point to these moments and argue that Azula was simply born cruel, but that's only part of the picture. Because while personality plays a role in who we become, environment shapes how those traits develop. And no one shaped Azula more than her father. One of the first things everyone noticed about Azula was her extraordinary talent for firebending. She wasn't just good. She was exceptional. For most firebenders, mastery takes years of relentless training. Azula made it look effortless. Her movements were precise. Her technique was nearly flawless. Even as a child, she displayed a level of discipline that most adults would struggle to achieve. Then, there was something even more remarkable. Her flames burned blue. Now, in the Avatar universe, blue fire isn't some separate form of bending. It's a visual representation of just how intense and concentrated her flames are. Blue fire burns hotter than ordinary orange fire, and the series uses it to immediately tell the audience something important. Azula isn't just another skilled firebender. She's operating on an entirely different level. That talent didn't go unnoticed, especially not by Ozai. If there was one thing Ozai admired above all else, it was strength. And Azula had it in abundance. While Zuko struggled to meet his father's impossible expectations, Azula seemed to exceed them without breaking a sweat. She learned quickly. She fought brilliantly. She stayed calm under pressure. Most importantly, she embodied everything Ozai believed a ruler should be: confident, ruthless, uncompromising. As a result, Ozai made very little effort to hide which child he preferred. Throughout their childhood, Azula received praise that Zuko rarely experienced. Whenever she succeeded, Ozai rewarded her. Whenever Zuko failed, Ozai criticized him. At first glance, it almost seems like Azula had the better childhood. She was the favorite. She had the talent. She had her father's approval. But that's exactly where people misunderstand her story. Because favoritism isn't the same thing as love. Ozai didn't love Azula because she was his daughter. He valued her because she reflected his own ideals. Think about that for a second. Every compliment Azula received came after she proved herself, after she demonstrated strength, after she displayed intelligence, after she achieved something impressive. What message does that send to a child? It teaches them that their worth depends on their performance, that being loved isn't automatic. It's something you earn. And if you stop being exceptional, you might stop being worthy altogether. That's an enormous amount of pressure for anyone, especially a child. Without even realizing it, Azula began tying her entire identity to being perfect. Making mistakes wasn't simply embarrassing, it became terrifying. Because failure didn't just mean she disappointed herself. It meant she might disappoint the one person whose approval she desperately wanted: her father. Ironically, while Ozai saw Azula as the perfect child, there was someone else who looked at her and saw something completely different: her mother, Ursa. Unlike Ozai, Ursa wasn't impressed by Azula's ruthlessness. She noticed how easily Azula lied. She noticed how much she enjoyed getting under Zuko's skin. She noticed that her daughter often smiled during moments that should have upset her. One of the most talked about scenes in the series comes when Ursa quietly says, "What's wrong with that child?" For years, fans have debated those words. Did Ursa truly fear Azula? Or was she simply frightened by the path Ozai was leading her down? Personally, I think it's the second. Because throughout the series, and especially in the comics, there's plenty of evidence that Ursa loved both of her children. The difference is that she understood Zuko much more easily than she understood Azula. And children notice things like that. Azula noticed every hug Zuko received, every comforting word, every time Ursa defended him. Whether it was true or not, Azula slowly convinced herself that her mother loved Zuko more. That belief would stay with her for the rest of her life. In fact, years later, after she had become one of the most feared people in the world, the voice that haunted her mind wasn't Ozai's, it was Ursa's. And that tells you everything you need to know about which relationship truly left the deepest scar. But before those emotional wounds had a chance to heal, tragedy struck the royal family. And from that moment on, Azula's life would never be the same again. The turning point in Azula's life didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened inside the royal palace. By now, Fire Lord Ozai was growing old, and the question of who would eventually inherit the throne had become impossible to ignore. As the younger son, Ozai believed he was far more capable than his older brother Iroh, especially after Iroh's son, Lu Ten, was killed during the siege of Ba Sing Se. Seeing an opportunity, Ozai approached his father and argued that Iroh's line had effectively come to an end, and that he deserved to become Fire Lord instead. It was an incredibly cold thing to suggest, and Azula was furious. As punishment, he ordered Ozai to experience the same pain Iroh had just suffered. According to the official story expanded in the comics, that meant Zuko's life was suddenly in danger. Ursa refused to let that happen. To save her son, she made an impossible choice. She secretly helped arrange the death of Fire Lord Azula, allowing Ozai to take the throne. But there was a price. Ursa was forced to leave the palace and never return. Overnight, both Zuko and Azula lost their mother. For Zuko, it was heartbreaking. For Azula, it was confusing. She never truly understood why Ursa disappeared, and because nobody gave her the full truth, she filled in the blanks herself. Deep down, she convinced herself that her mother had always preferred Zuko anyway. So when Ursa vanished without saying goodbye, it only reinforced what Azula already feared, that she wasn't loved the way her brother was. Whether that belief was true didn't really matter. To Azula, it became the truth. And from that moment on, Ozai became the only parent left in her life. That was exactly the environment he wanted. Without Ursa around, there was no one left to balance Ozai's influence. No one to remind Azula that compassion wasn't weakness. No one to tell her that people deserved kindness simply because they were people. Instead, every lesson came from Ozai. He taught her that emotions clouded judgment. Mercy was for the weak. Power was the only thing people truly respected. And if you wanted absolute loyalty, you didn't earn love. You inspired fear. At first, that philosophy seemed to work perfectly. Everywhere Azula went, people obeyed her. Servants stood at attention. Soldiers followed her orders without hesitation. Even experienced military leaders respected her intelligence. By the time she was a teenager, she wasn't simply another member of the royal family. She had become one of the Fire Nation's greatest assets. That confidence is exactly why Ozai chose her for one of the most important missions of the war. After Zuko failed to capture the Avatar and was branded a traitor alongside Iroh, Ozai sent Azula to bring them home. Officially, it was a rescue mission. In reality, it was a rescue mission. In reality, it was a trap. Ozai knew Zuko had become a disgrace to the family. If Zuko resisted arrest, Azula had full authority to deal with him however she saw fit. Right away, we see one of Azula's greatest strengths, not her firebending, but her understanding of people. Instead of relying only on soldiers, she recruited two childhood friends, Mai and Ty Lee. Now, this is where Azula becomes especially interesting. A lot of people assume Mai and Ty Lee followed her because they admired her. That's only partly true. Ty Lee actually refused Azula's invitation at first. She was happy performing in the circus and had no interest in joining a military campaign. So what did Azula do? She created a situation where the circus performance suddenly became very dangerous, making Ty Lee's safest option joining her instead. Technically, she gave Ty Lee a choice. Realistically, there wasn't one. Mai wasn't much different. Azula understood that Mai cared deeply about Zuko, but she also knew Mai rarely showed emotion and hated disappointing people in power. Azula used that knowledge to pull Mai back into her orbit. This is one of Azula's defining traits throughout the series. She doesn't simply overpower people. She studies them. She learns what they want, what they fear, and what they're trying to hide. Then she uses that information with frightening precision. It's exactly why she's such a dangerous villain. She's always thinking several moves ahead. As the hunt for the Avatar continued, Azula repeatedly demonstrated why she was considered a military genius. Whether it was tracking Team Avatar across the Earth Kingdom, infiltrating enemy territory, or adapting to impossible situations, she almost always had a backup plan. Then came perhaps her greatest achievement, the fall of Ba Sing Se. For almost 100 years, the Fire Nation had failed to conquer the Earth Kingdom's greatest city. Entire armies couldn't do it. Powerful generals couldn't do it. Azula accomplished it through deception. Disguising herself as a Kyoshi warrior, she quietly infiltrated the city, manipulated Long Feng, turned the Dai Li against their own leaders, and handed Ba Sing Se to the Fire Nation from the inside. It's one of the smartest victories in the entire franchise. And once again, it reinforced the lesson Ozai had taught her as a child. Manipulation works, fear works, control works. Everything she'd believed about the world seemed to be proven right. Even Zuko finally chose her side. After helping defeat the Avatar beneath Ba Sing Se, Zuko returned home as a prince once again. For a brief moment, it looked like everything Azula had ever wanted was finally coming together. She had pleased her father. She had conquered the impossible. She had her brother back. But beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. The problem with building your entire life on fear is that fear only lasts as long as people are afraid. The moment they stop, everything begins to collapse. That collapse starts during the day of Black Sun. Even though the invasion ultimately failed, Azula spent the entire eclipse psychologically manipulating her enemies instead of fighting them. She stalled for time, provoked them into making mistakes, and calmly waited until firebending returned. Again, she won without needing raw strength. But shortly afterward, she suffered something she had never really experienced before: betrayal. When Mai chose to save Zuko instead of obeying Azula, the princess couldn't believe what she was seeing. Mai looked directly at her and said something that completely shattered Azula's worldview. "I love Zuko more than I fear you." That sentence is devastating, because it proves Ozai was wrong. Fear isn't stronger than love. Love had just defeated fear. Before Azula could even process that revelation, Ty Lee made her own choice. She turned against Azula as well. In the span of just a few minutes, the two people Azula trusted most chose each other over her. To most people, it was simply a betrayal. To Azula, it was proof that the philosophy she'd built her entire life around had failed. If fear couldn't keep even her closest friends loyal, then what could? From that moment forward, Azula became increasingly paranoid. She questioned everyone's loyalty. She dismissed servants over tiny mistakes. She saw conspiracies where none existed. She isolated herself because she no longer believed anyone could be trusted. And then came the final blow. Before leaving to burn the Earth Kingdom, Ozai announced that he would become the Phoenix King. Azula expected to fight beside him. Instead, Ozai left her behind to rule the Fire Nation. At first glance, that sounds like an incredible honor. But think about it from Azula's perspective. The one person she'd spent her entire life trying to impress had just abandoned her at the most important moment. Once again, her worth depended entirely on Ozai's approval, and once again, he chose power over his daughter. That was the moment the mask finally cracked. Sleep became impossible. Her thoughts spiraled out of control. She began hallucinating conversations with Ursa, the mother she'd spent years convincing herself never loved her. Those scenes aren't just frightening, they're tragic. Because underneath all the arrogance, all the confidence, and all the cruelty, we finally meet the frightened little girl who never stopped wondering why her mother left. By the time Zuko challenged her to an Agni Kai, Azula was no longer the composed strategist we'd watched throughout the series. She was exhausted, emotionally unstable, consumed by anger and paranoia. Her fire still burned blue. But for the first time, it lacked its usual precision. It exploded wildly instead of flowing with control. The duel itself perfectly reflects Azula's mental state. Zuko doesn't defeat the same opponent who conquered Ba Sing Se. He defeats a version of Azula who has already been fighting herself for weeks. When Katara finally chains Azula to the grate and the battle ends, the princess completely breaks down. She screams, she cries, she thrashes against the chains. It's one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire series because there isn't any triumph in it, only tragedy. The girl who had spent her entire life believing she had to be perfect had finally reached the point where she couldn't hold herself together anymore. And contrary to what many fans think, that's not actually where Azula's story ends. The official comics reveal that she survives, remains deeply troubled, and continues struggling with her identity, her relationship with Zuko, and the lingering emotional wounds left by Ozai and Ursa. They don't magically cure her or turn her into a hero overnight. Instead, they show that recovery isn't simple for someone whose entire worldview was built on fear and manipulation. So, was Azula born evil? The series never gives us a simple yes or no. She made terrible choices, hurt countless people, and must be held responsible for those actions, but it's also impossible to ignore the environment that shaped her. She was praised only when she succeeded, taught that fear mattered more than love, raised by a father who saw children as tools, and haunted by the belief that the one person whose love she truly wanted had rejected her. Azula isn't tragic because she was innocent. She's tragic because she never had the chance to become anything else.